Bob Odenkirk, throughout many years, has lived as if he was carrying on his shoulders two parallel lives, and both were heavy in different ways. One part of the man was the silence behind the scenes, where he constantly wrote laughter for others, but rarely saw a smile meant for himself. The other part was an actor always trying to step into the spotlight, but every time he moved forward, it felt like having to convince the world that he deserved to exist there. The biggest pain did not lie in clear failure, but in the prolonged feeling of being overlooked when his efforts dissolved into comedy shows that the public remembered others for more than the one who created them. He lived in a state of both being present and invisible, both the creator of value and the one not recognized. But in that quiet exhaustion, Bob still did not stop. He continued to write, continued to act, continued to move forward as if one day the world would be forced to see him, even if it took dozens of years. His will did not come from an explosion, but from prolonged endurance, from not allowing himself to disappear completely in the industry that he both loved and was swallowed by. Even though he was underrated for a long time, Bob Odenkirk still built a respectable career in the American comedy and television world. He was a writer for Saturday Night Live in the late 1980s and early 1990s, contributing to many iconic comedy sketches. After that, he continued to affirm his creative ability with The Ben Stiller Show, the program that helped him win an Emmy for writing in a variety or music program. Together with David Cross, he co-created Mr. A. Show with Bob and David, a cult classic comedy series highly regarded by critics and later becoming a major influence foundation for the independent comedy generation. However, it was not until the role of Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad, and especially Better Call Saul, that his career truly exploded. The role of Saul brought him multiple Emmy nominations for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, along with global recognition for both audiences and critics. Besides that, he also surprised everyone with the lead role in the action movie Nobody in 2021, proving his ability to transcend genres. These achievements transformed Bob Odenkirk from an underrated comedy writer into one of the most versatile and respected artists in modern television. Before moving to the next part of the story, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the tearful journey behind Bob Odenkirk's life. Your small support is a tribute to a man who has persistently survived between two lives that seemed like no one saw. After the early years of life, living with the feeling of being overlooked by the world, even though he was always present, Bob Odenkirk entered his childhood in an environment that seemed stable but lacked the most important thing: emotional safety. His family belonged to the middle class, where everything seemed materially sufficient, but inside it was a cold space where recognition was not something easily given. Bob's father was a strict person, always setting high standards and rarely showing praise or encouragement. In his world, effort seemed to be only the minimum, while success was the only thing worth noting. And in that environment, Bob grew up with the feeling that he always had to try even harder. But no matter how hard he tried, it was very difficult to truly become good enough. Without warm words of encouragement, without nods of approval, Bob gradually learned to evaluate himself through the eyes of others, and that caused him to form a feeling that lasted for many years, the feeling of not being valuable enough. In those years, he was not the standout child, nor the one easily noticed. He observed more than he participated, listened more than he spoke. Between family conversations or in the school environment, Bob often chose to stand aside, as if existing on the edge of every story was the safest thing. It was in that silence that an inner world began to form. Bob became introverted, but not because he did not want to connect, but because he was not sure he was valuable enough to be listened to. Every time he tried to express himself, no matter how small, it came with hesitation and self-doubt. Gradually, he learned to observe people, behaviors, reactions, and the silences between conversations. Those observations did not turn him into a more sociable child. but became the foundation for another ability: the ability to understand humor as a survival mechanism. Humor came to Bob not like a joyful gift of childhood, but like a way to hide emotions that could not be spoken. When he could not become good enough according to expectations, he learned to make others laugh, because laughter at least brought a feeling of acceptance, even if only for a brief moment. In conversations, a well-timed joke could help him avoid awkward silence and, more importantly, help him feel he was not completely invisible. But behind those moments, there was still a child who always wondered if he was doing it right, if he was good enough, or if he was simply trying to fill a gap that no one else saw. The lack of praise in the family made Bob gradually form a very strict inner standard. He did not learn to be satisfied with himself, but learned to always think that he could do better. That became both a motivation and a burden. It pushed him forward, but also made him never truly feel at ease with himself. In those years, there were no major incidents, no clear shocks for the outside world to notice, but inside Bob, there was a quiet accumulation of pressure, self-doubt, and the desire to be recognized. His childhood was not a loud, tragic story, but a long chain of small but repeated moments where silence replaced praise and expectations replaced understanding. It was in that environment that Bob Odenkirk learned to exist without needing to be seen, but at the same time also began to form a deep longing, the longing that one day his voice would truly be listened to, not as someone standing behind, but as a person with his own distinct value. And although at that time he did not know, those seemingly normal years would become the foundation for a life stretched between light and shadow, between presence and the feeling of never being fully recognized. After those childhood years that passed in the absence of recognition and the feeling of always having to prove his own value, Bob Odenkirk stepped into adulthood with a choice that seemed light, but carried all the unhealed wounds inside him: comedy. But for Bob, comedy did not begin as a shining dream on stage, but as a spiritual survival mechanism, a way to turn inner pressures into something that could be controlled. When the world inside him became too heavy, he did not turn to direct emotional expression, but to writing, where he could place his pain into other characters, into different situations, into lines that could make others laugh instead of making himself collapse. Bob did not step onto the stage right from the beginning. He started by standing behind it, writing things that others would perform. There he found a form of quiet power, the ability to create emotional reactions from the audience without having to fully reveal himself. But even in that seeming safety, another feeling gradually appeared. He saw others receive the laughter, the attention, and the recognition, while he was only a name that appeared very small in the final credits, if at all. And so the old loop returned, existing but not being seen, contributing but not being fully recognized. When Bob joined Saturday Night Live, he stepped into one of the harshest environments in the comedy industry. There, everything operated at high speed, with great pressure and non-stop competition. Scripts had to be constantly written, revised, cut, and rewritten in extremely short time. There was no room for slowing down, no space for prolonged self-doubt. In that environment, Bob was not the main performer, but one of those standing behind, continuously creating material for others to shine on national television. Every week, the sketches that aired were the result of hours of intense work, where ideas were judged, discarded, or edited until they were almost unrecognizable from their original form. Bob witnessed moments where his creative effort could disappear in just a few minutes, or become a very small part of a larger product that the public only remembered the performers for. Even as a main writer, even as someone who contributed ideas, he was still often pushed behind the lights, where his name existed only as a tiny line in a long list of participants. The pressure of writing at SNL came not only from the workload, but also from the harshness of having to constantly create laughter in an environment with no room for failure. Every ineffective idea was not just a mistake, but a question mark about competence. And in that repeating chain of days, Bob continued to face the familiar feeling from childhood, the feeling of having to prove his value in a space where recognition was never guaranteed. Even though his contributions were the foundation for many successful sketches, Bob was still frequently in the position where he was not the first one mentioned. The public saw the actors, saw the characters, saw the funny moments on screen, but rarely knew the person who had created the structure for that moment. And that gradually became a form of quiet pain, not loud, but prolonged. When a person devoted all his intellect and time to other people's laughter, but could not fully step into the light himself. In the late nights of scriptwriting, when the office gradually fell silent and only the cold fluorescent lights remained, Bob continued to sit with his work. He revised every line, adjusted every comedic rhythm, trying to find the best version of an idea, even though sometimes he himself was not sure if it would be kept or not. But he still did it, not because recognition was certain, but because he could not stop. Comedy, for Bob, was not just a job, but the only way he knew to turn the heaviness in his mind into something that could exist outside. And throughout that period, Bob Odenkirk lived in a prolonged paradox. He was the one creating laughter for millions of viewers, but rarely felt that he truly stood at the center of those laughs. It was a form of existence that was both meaningful and empty, both full of dedication and lacking recognition. And it was precisely in that contradiction that his life began to form another layer of quiet perseverance, something that would follow him for many decades afterward. After those years working in the harsh environment of Saturday Night Live, Bob Odenkirk moved into a new phase of his life, where he thought he would have the chance to escape the invisible shadow that had followed him for many years. But instead of clearer light, he stepped into a longer, quieter, and even lonelier journey. The years of writing scripts in the shadow of others, where talent could be recognized in professional circles but almost never reached the general public. Bob continued to participate in many different comedy projects, from television to independent programs, always in the role of writer or co-creator, but rarely as the central face. He was the one building the structure for laughter, the one refining the rhythm of a comedic scene, the one making everything run smoothly behind the scenes. However, in the eyes of the public, he was still an unfamiliar name, not tied to any iconic image. Every successful project he joined brought a certain professional satisfaction, but not enough to erase the feeling that he himself had not yet truly arrived. One of the most important milestones of this period was Mr. Time Brote, Show with Bob and David, the project he co-created with David Cross. This was where Bob had more creative freedom than ever, where he could clearly express his comedic style, sharp, absurd, sometimes deeply satirical about society and media. In the industry, Mr. Montime Tufriam Show was highly regarded, becoming a cult classic work that strongly influenced many later generations of comedians. But that success carried a familiar paradox. It was respected in professional circles, but did not reach the broad audience. There were no explosive rating numbers, no widespread public recognition, no feeling of cultural dominance like other big comedy shows. And therefore, even though Mr. Tomtree Show was an important creative step forward, it still did not change Bob's position in the eyes of the public. He remained the one standing behind, the one creating ideas, the one respected by people in the profession, but not the face that the general audience immediately recognized. Throughout this period, Bob continuously lived in a state of professional contradiction. He worked non-stop, participated in many projects, created content highly regarded for creativity, but still did not have the feeling of getting closer to widespread recognition. Each time a project ended, he started another one, as if trying to build an invisible bridge leading to a place he was not even sure existed. And in that process, a familiar feeling gradually returned, the feeling he had carried from childhood, the feeling of wondering whether he was really good enough or not. Always being in a supporting position rather than the center became a prolonged reality for many years. Bob watched others, sometimes younger colleagues, sometimes other artists in the same field, step into the spotlight, becoming the face representing products that he had also helped create. He did not deny their talent, but inside him there was always a quiet question. Why am I still standing here while others have gone further in the public's perception? Self-doubt did not come in an explosive way, but like an underground stream flowing slowly but continuously. It appeared in meetings, in times when scripts were edited, in moments when one of his ideas was replaced by another, more suitable idea. Even though he continued to work, continued to contribute, Bob began to feel more clearly that his path was not like those of the people he had seen achieve quick success. His path was longer, more winding, and full of segments without light. There were times when he thought he was getting closer to something big, but then everything returned to the old state. Work continued, projects continued, but recognition remained far away. And precisely in that repetition, Bob Odenkirk lived through one of the longest periods of his career, where he was no longer a hopeful newcomer, but had never become a big name in the eyes of the public. He existed between two worlds, good enough to keep working, but not prominent enough to be remembered. And that very in-between state lasted for many years, becoming a form of silent challenge that no one saw, but he had to carry every day. After many years of tireless creation in the shadows of the comedy industry, Bob Odenkirk entered a phase that he himself could later consider the longest and heaviest part of his career, a period of prolonged failure, not loud, not a clear collapse, but quietly eroding all the expectations inside him. This was not failure in the form of a big fall that everyone could see, but a long chain of days without breakthroughs, where effort seemed to stop at the threshold of recognition but never truly crossed it. In the eyes of Hollywood, Bob Odenkirk was not a name born to stand at the center. He was framed in the image of a good comedy writer, an intelligent creator, but not a face suitable for leading roles. The doors for big roles, for central characters, seemed to always open for others, while he stood outside, observing, waiting, and sometimes wondering if he was waiting for something that had never been destined for him. Even though his talent was not completely denied, it was also not enough to break the stereotypes that had formed in the industry. During this period, Bob participated in many different projects, both television and film, but most of them did not meet commercial expectations. There were works that were well regarded creatively, but failed to attract the general audience. There were roles he took on with the hope that they would open a new direction, but in the end, they sank into silence. Each project that passed felt like another test from fate, where the result was never strong enough to change his position in the entertainment industry. The feeling of being stuck began to become clearer over time. Bob was no longer in the position of a newcomer trying to find his footing, but he had also never become someone widely recognized. He existed in a strange professional void, where his presence was acknowledged, but the value of that presence was never elevated into an icon. This created a prolonged psychological state, like walking on a long road where the end was never visible, and he could not turn back. His career continued uninterrupted, but lacked a clear turning point to completely change its trajectory. There was no single explosive moment big enough to make the world look at him differently. Instead, there were only small steps forward, opportunities that came and went, hopes that were kindled and then quietly extinguished. In all of that, Bob still continued to work, still continued to write, still continued to act, as if stopping had never been a real option. But the very prolongation of this state began to create an increasingly heavy mental pressure. Not the pressure of clear failure, but the pressure of not knowing where he stood in his career journey. Each passing year brought a question without an answer. Am I moving forward, standing still, or gradually being forgotten? And when that question repeated long enough, it was no longer a passing thought, but became part of his daily awareness. Bob watched many of his colleagues achieve clearer turning points, people who could transform themselves faster and more easily in the public's eyes. Meanwhile, he continued to stay in familiar roles, in projects not big enough to change the game. This did not make him stop working, but it made every effort feel heavier because it always came with the expectation that this time it might be different, even though reality rarely was. Over time, the fatigue was not only physical or work-related, but seeped deep into the way he viewed himself. A person who once used comedy as a way to cope with life now had to face his own comedy career as a journey without a clear solution. He did not fall into collapse, but he also did not find elevation. It was all just continuation, prolongation, and repetition. In this long period, Bob Odenkirk did not disappear, but he also did not truly appear in the way Hollywood usually recognized. He was like someone always near the center of the industry, but never placed exactly at that center. And that very close but not there state lasted for many years, creating one of the longest and heaviest chapters in his life, where success did not disappear completely, but also never truly came close. After many long years of living with the feeling of being trapped between projects that created no breakthrough and a career that seemed to only quietly drift through the entertainment industry, Bob Odenkirk stepped into a role that initially even he himself could not imagine would change the entire trajectory of his life. It was not a lead role. It was also not a role built to become the center of the story. It was only a supporting character in a television series that was gradually shaping up to become a phenomenon. Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad. When Bob took the role of Saul Goodman, there were no signs at all that this character would become an icon. In the initial script, Saul was just a bland lawyer with a humorous touch, appearing to create light moments in a story that was becoming increasingly dark. No one, not even the producers, really expected that this character would go beyond its original limits. For Bob, this was just another opportunity in the long chain of roles he had taken. A chance to work, to show his ability, but not a promise of major change. Yet, what no one could foresee began to happen in a very natural way. Saul Goodman, under Bob Odenkirk's portrayal, was not simply a funny character. He brought to this character a strange mix of humor, sharpness, and something tired and pragmatic, as if behind every joke was an entire life that had grown used to maneuvering in imperfect situations. The audience began to pay attention not only because of the dialogue, but because of the way this character existed in the dark world of Breaking Bad, like a piece that was both out of place and necessary. At first, it was just small reactions. A few scenes made the audience laugh more than expected. A few moments made Saul Goodman more memorable than other supporting characters. But over time, that attention began to accumulate. Viewers not only waited for the main story, but also waited for Saul's appearances. And the strange thing was that this initially undervalued character gradually became one of the irreplaceable bright spots of the series. For Bob Odenkirk, this was an experience that was both familiar and strange. Familiar because he had spent his entire career standing behind or on the sidelines of big stories. Strange because this time that sideline began to be seen more clearly than ever. But even as the attention started to shift, he still could not immediately realize that something was truly changing. For a while, Bob still thought this was just another interesting role in his long chain of work, not a destined turning point. However, as Breaking Bad increasingly became a global cultural phenomenon, Saul Goodman also gradually escaped his original position. This character no longer existed merely as a supporting element, but began to carry its own weight in the story. And along with that, Bob Odenkirk also began to step out of the shadow he had lived in for many decades. For the first time in a very long time, his name was no longer tied to the role of the writer behind the scenes, or the little-noticed supporting actor, but began to be mentioned as an indispensable part of the success. This change did not happen suddenly, but like a slow yet irreversible flow. From the first episodes to the later seasons of Breaking Bad, Saul Goodman gradually became a character that audiences could not ignore. And as the attention grew, Bob Odenkirk also began to realize that he was standing before something completely different from everything he had experienced before. No longer just the person standing behind the lights, he was beginning to be seen. The most important thing in this period was not the fame that came quickly, but the change in the way he was recognized. Hollywood, which had once viewed him as a capable comedy writer but not a central face, now began to look at him differently, not as an instantly created star, but as someone who had quietly accumulated experience and was finally given the chance to shine at the right time. As the role of Saul Goodman gradually became iconic, Bob Odenkirk's career officially entered a new phase. No longer just the years of experimentation and waiting, he began to be seen as a real actor capable of leading a story. And the most notable thing was that this change did not come from him changing himself, but from the world finally beginning to see the person he had always been, but had never been recognized for. After Saul Goodman began to attract strong attention from audiences in Breaking Bad, this character was no longer simply an entertaining supporting role. Under Bob Odenkirk's hands, Saul gradually became a much more complex entity than what the initial script suggested. He was not just a scheming lawyer who talked fast, was smart and funny in tense situations, but also a person carrying many layers of wounds, fatigue, and long compromises with his own life. It was this combination of laughter and darkness that made the character stand out, and also led Bob Odenkirk into a completely new phase of acting. Saul Goodman was a character living on the boundary between two worlds. On one hand, he was the embodiment of sharp humor, of lightning-fast dialogue, of the ability to turn dangerous situations into almost absurd yet captivating moments. But on the other hand, behind that shell was a person who always had to adapt in order to survive in an unforgiving world. Bob Odenkirk not only portrayed Saul's humorous side, but also began to bring in pauses, glances, and moments of prolonged silence that lasted only a few seconds, but carried the feeling of someone who had grown used to living in compromise. It was in that contrast that Jimmy McGill, the real person behind Saul Goodman, began to become clearer. If Saul was the mask created to survive, then Jimmy was the human part that had once tried to live honestly, tried to become a decent lawyer, a person recognized in an official way. But life did not give Jimmy an easy path. Every small choice, every failure, every time he was underestimated, had gradually pushed him away from the person he once wanted to become. And Bob Odenkirk was the one who had to carry both of those people on his shoulders in the same role. What made this role special was not only the script, but also the way Bob Odenkirk expressed that inner conflict. He did not turn Saul or Jimmy into two clearly separate characters, but let them exist simultaneously, overlapping in every expression, every word, every moment of silence. There were times when the audience saw explosive humor, but right after that was a fleeting look of fatigue, as if the character had just realized that everything he was doing was only a way to prolong his existence. In the process of Better Call Saul being developed, this complexity became even deeper. No longer an entertaining supporting character, Saul/Jimmy became the center of a complete story about human transformation under the pressure of choices, environment, and circumstances. Bob Odenkirk at this point was no longer simply the person portraying the role, but became the one guiding the entire emotional journey of the character through many years. Each episode was another layer peeled away, revealing more of the changing person inside. Bob Odenkirk's acting career from here became more complex and profound than ever before. He was no longer limited to the image of a comedian or a writer behind the scenes, but was recognized as an actor capable of expressing rare psychological depth on television. The role of Saul Goodman was not only a career turning point, but also the place where he synthesized all those undervalued experiences, the years of waiting, the times of being overlooked, and turned them into a living, breathing character. What mattered most was that this role did not just bring success, but brought belated yet clear recognition. Everything Bob had built over dozens of years was finally seen through a single character. Saul Goodman became the biggest mark in his career, not because it was the only role, but because it was the convergence point of the entire long journey he had traveled. And in the combination of laughter and pain, between comedy and tragedy, Bob Odenkirk found a more complete version of himself, where the two lives he had lived in parallel finally met in the same person on screen. After Saul Goodman became an inseparable icon from the success of Breaking Bad, Bob Odenkirk's journey did not stop there. Instead, it entered a deeper, heavier, and much more personal phase with Better Call Saul, a series that not only told the story of one character, but gradually peeled away the entire process of a person's mental collapse. This was no longer an upgraded supporting role, but a tragedy stretched over many years, where Jimmy McGill did not just exist on screen, but seemed to reflect the inner journey of the man portraying him. Jimmy McGill in Better Call Saul did not immediately become Saul Goodman. Instead, the character went through a slow, almost painful transformation, where every small decision contributed to pushing him further away from the person he once wanted to become. Bob Odenkirk had to portray not just one character, but an entire chain of psychological changes stretched over many years, from a lawyer trying to do the right thing to a person gradually accepting that rules and morality no longer brought him fair results. That transformation did not happen suddenly, but was a process of cracking little by little, where faith was eroded over time. What made this role particularly heavy for Bob was the level of emotional exhaustion it demanded. Unlike roles with clear highlights or short-term climaxes, Jimmy McGill was a journey stretched across multiple seasons, where each episode required a subtle psychological state, sometimes just a glance, a silence, or a moment of hesitation lasting a few seconds but carrying the full weight of wrong choices. Bob did not just act. He had to live with this character for many continuous years, carrying the emotions of a person slowly losing himself. As Better Call Saul delved deeper into the story, the pressure on Bob Odenkirk increased accordingly. This was no longer a simple role, but became one of the most complex central roles in modern television. Each season was a step forward in Jimmy's inner collapse, and each of those steps demanded that Bob dig deeper into emotional territories he had only touched indirectly before. His acting career at this point was no longer experimental or about seeking opportunities, but became a prolonged artistic responsibility, where every expressive choice could change how audiences perceived the entire character. The success of Better Call Saul came gradually but surely, much like the pace of the story it told. It was not loud like series that exploded immediately, but over time it was widely recognized as one of the finest television works ever created. And along with that recognition, Bob Odenkirk also began to receive the acclaim he had waited for almost his entire career. No longer just the comedy writer or Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad, he became the center of one of the most highly regarded acting performances of the decade. But the paradox lay in this. This recognition came at a stage when Bob was no longer young, after dozens of years of waiting, after countless projects that created no breakthrough, after long periods of being seen as unsuitable for leading roles. He finally reached the peak of his career, but not at the time many people usually imagine for a star. This brought a feeling that was both successful and heavy, as if he had traveled the entire longest road to reach a place where he could have stood much earlier. The global recognition for Bob Odenkirk during this period came not only from critics, but also from audiences around the world. Better Call Saul helped him become a familiar face in discussions about acting, about storytelling, and about character development on television. But beneath that spotlight was a prolonged process of emotional depletion, where Bob had to continuously recreate a person collapsing slowly and in a controlled way. The peak of his career, for Bob Odenkirk, was not a single explosive moment, but a long curve, where success and pressure existed side by side. He achieved what many in the industry dreamed of, but at the same time had to carry the full weight of a long journey full of doubt, failure, and waiting. And in all of that, Better Call Saul was not just a television series, but became the milestone that redefined his entire artistic life, where perseverance finally met recognition, even if it was belated and full of weight. After Better Call Saul gradually brought Bob Odenkirk to the belated peak of his career, where he was finally recognized globally as one of the finest television actors of his generation. Behind that spotlight existed a completely different part of life apart, unrelated to the camera, unrelated to awards, and unrelated to public attention. That was family life, where Bob was not Saul Goodman or Jimmy McGill, but only a husband, a father, and a person trying to keep everything around him from being swept away by the pressure of the very career he had pursued for dozens of years. Throughout his long journey, family always played the role of a quiet but extremely important anchor for Bob Odenkirk. His wife, Naomi Odenkirk, was not only his life partner, but also a long-term companion in his career, someone who understood the ups and downs, the prolonged periods of failure, and the moments that seemed to have no way out in the entertainment industry. Without being loud or showy, her presence was like a stable pillar, helping Bob not to be completely swept into the whirlwind of Hollywood, which was always changing and harsh. Bob's children grew up in an environment where their father was a familiar name in the entertainment industry, but they were not placed at the center of the spotlight. Bob and Naomi both chose to keep their children's lives as normal as possible, staying away from the showiness of fame and the media. This was not only a protective decision, but also a way to preserve the real person in family life, completely separate from the public image Bob had to embody every day. Even as one of the prominent faces of American television, Bob Odenkirk was a very private person about his personal life. He rarely shared details about his family in the media, and he did not turn his personal life into part of his public image. This separation was not distance, but a conscious choice to protect his loved ones from the pressure of fame. In an industry where personal life is often exposed and exploited, Bob chose to keep everything within a private boundary, like a clear line between the two worlds he was forced to live in parallel. Family had become the only place that maintained mental stability for Bob throughout the most stressful years of his career. When work demanded that he constantly dive deep into complex, highly emotional characters, even prolonged heavy psychological states, family was the place that helped him return to a normal state, not as a television star, not as an iconic character, but as a man in the simplest moments of everyday life. Bob Odenkirk's life outside Hollywood therefore carried a clear contrast with the image the public usually saw. On screen, he was a sharp, intelligent character, sometimes chaotic and full of inner turmoil. But in real life, he chose simplicity, stability, and privacy. There were no constant glamorous parties, no dense appearances in the media, and no flaunting of fame. Instead, it was a somewhat quiet life, where family values were placed above all professional achievements. What was notable was that this very separation helped Bob maintain balance in a long career full of pressure. When he faced roles that demanded emotional exhaustion or prolonged stressful work periods, family was always the place he returned to so he would not be completely swept into the characters he embodied. While the outside world saw an actor at the peak of his career, in his private life he was trying to maintain a rare normalcy that fame could easily break. Family did not diminish Bob Odenkirk's career, but it helped him keep a part of himself from being lost in the process of becoming a television icon. And throughout his entire long journey, full of failures, waiting, belated success, and major turning points, it was the quiet presence of family that created an anchor that no stage light could replace. After building a solid family foundation, where Bob Odenkirk could always return like a rare anchor amid the chaotic world of Hollywood, inside him there was a completely opposite flow process of accumulated pressure stretching over decades that no one really saw. This was not a sudden collapse, Not a single incident that could be pointed to and said, "This is the moment everything changed," but a slow, quiet, and continuous erosion, where a person's spirit was worn down by the non-stop pace of work and expectations. Bob Odenkirk had spent almost his entire adult life in a state of non-stop work. From the early days, writing scripts for SNL, to independent comedy projects, then television series, and later bigger roles, he had never truly stepped out of the creative cycle. But that very continuity carried an invisible price: prolonged mental fatigue in silence. It was not the kind of fatigue that could disappear after a few days of rest, but a form of accumulated exhaustion, where the mind was always in a state of having to function, having to create, having to prove, having to continue. For many years, Bob lived with a feeling that was hard to name but always present: the feeling that he had not achieved success at the right time. When looking back at his career journey, he did not lack important milestones, did not lack valuable projects, but there was always a gap in his inner perception where he wondered if he had arrived too late, or if he had taken a longer road than necessary. Success came to him, but not in the way society usually imagines an artist's career: quick, brilliant, and clear. Instead, it came slowly, step by step, and always accompanied by the feeling that behind it were too many years of waiting. One of the factors that made this pressure even heavier was that Bob always set very high standards for himself. He did not just want to do the job well, but wanted to do it at the highest possible level of perfection. In a creative environment, this was both a motivation and a burden. Every script, every role, every project became an inner test, where he faced not only others' judgment, but also his own strictness. And when the inner standard was always higher than what reality could achieve, the feeling of never being good enough became a familiar part of his life. Non-stop work for many years had created a rhythm of life in which Bob almost had no time to stop and look back at himself. He was always in a state of continuing to write, continuing to act, continuing to join new projects, as if stopping meant directly facing all the pressure being suppressed inside. And that very continuity, instead of relieving tension, unintentionally made tension become a prolonged state, almost default, in his life. What was worth noting was that in the eyes of the public, Bob Odenkirk appeared stable, even a belated but solid success. There were no scandals, no public collapses, no loud crises, but beneath that stability was a hidden process, where professional pressure accumulated year by year, project by project, role by role. It did not explode, but it did not disappear. It existed like a continuous background current, affecting the way he thought, the way he worked, and the way he viewed his own path. As time went on, this fatigue was no longer just a professional issue, but became part of his state of existence. Bob did not stop, did not withdraw, but he also never truly felt relieved. Even in the most successful periods, when his name was widely recognized, there still existed an underlying layer of pressure that could not be erased. The pressure to maintain, to continue, to not return to the invisible state as before. It was the combination of inner expectations, the prolonged pace of work, and the slower journey than others in achieving recognition that created a special form of tension in Bob Odenkirk's life. It did not break him in one moment, but it followed him through the years, becoming an inseparable part of the journey leading to his later successes. After many years of living in a state of quietly accumulated tension, where professional pressure and mental exhaustion always existed like a background current that never stopped, Bob Odenkirk stepped into what seemed like a normal day on the Better Call Saul set. There were no special signs beforehand. There was no warning from his body, no moment indicating that what was about to happen would become one of the most brutal turning points in his life. It was a workday like any other, where everything operated at the familiar pace of a large film crew, where Bob continued to perform the role that had been attached to him for many years. But in just a brief moment, everything changed completely. Bob Odenkirk suddenly collapsed right on the set. There was no preparation, no clear signs beforehand that anyone could have anticipated this situation. In an instant, the man who had stood before millions of viewers on big and small screens, the man who had spent his entire life building a career from small roles to iconic ones, had fallen in the middle of an ordinary workday. The atmosphere on the set changed immediately. Chaos quickly spread as the crew members realized the seriousness of the situation. Those present immediately rushed in to help, trying to perform emergency first aid measures before the professional medical team arrived. Every second that passed carried an indescribable heaviness as the boundary between life and loss became more fragile than ever. In that moment, everything that had once defined Bob Odenkirk's career, his fame, the years of dedication, the roles that had changed modern television all got pushed aside. There was no more Saul Goodman, no more Jimmy McGill, no more comedy writer or recognized actor. What remained was just a human being facing a life-and-death crisis right at the place where he worked. The incident happened so fast, but left a gap that felt endlessly long for those who witnessed it. When the medical team approached and began the resuscitation process, everything around seemed to slow down. The set lights, the camera equipment, the people who had worked with him every day all became a silent backdrop for a moment that no one could have prepared for. Bob Odenkirk, the man who had spent decades portraying complex characters on screen, now became the center of a script that was not in any story he had ever been part of. The scariest thing about this incident was not only its level of danger, but also its absolute suddenness. There was no long-term warning, no clear signs of decline right before that allowed anyone to predict it. It happened like a sudden cut, splitting time into before and after, turning an ordinary workday into an unpredictable boundary between life and death. In those tense minutes, Bob Odenkirk's entire career seemed to be completely paused. Every plan, every scene, every production process had to make way for a completely different battle, the battle between life and death. For the film crew, this was not just a work accident, but a profound emotional shock, as their colleague, friend, and artist whom they had worked with for a long time suddenly disappeared from the normal, safe state of life. This incident became a major breaking point in Bob Odenkirk's life, not only because of its severity, but also because of the way it shattered the entire chain of days that had already been stretched under silent pressure before. All the tension accumulated over many years, the non-stop working hours, the unreleased mental pressures, now seemed to converge in a single moment, where the body was forced to stop in a way the mind never wanted. From that second onward, Bob Odenkirk's life was no longer defined only by career or fame. It was clearly divided into two parts, before and after the day he collapsed on the set. And in the silent space after that incident, a bigger question began to emerge, not only for him, but also for all those who witnessed it. How can a person continue after standing so close to the edge of the end? After the life-and-death moment on the set, when Bob Odenkirk suddenly collapsed and the boundary between life and silence was almost erased in a few tense minutes, his life stepped into a completely different state of phase, no longer defined by work, roles, or career, but by the fragility of existence itself. As he was gradually brought back from the brink, the recovery journey did not unfold like a straight line, but like a long chain of slow, heavy days, where every breath carried the meaning of still being alive. The recovery process after the heart attack lasted longer than anyone could imagine. Bob's body was no longer in the state he had grown used to after dozens of years of continuous work in the entertainment industry. The physical exhaustion showed clearly in every movement, every step, every moment he tried to return to a normal rhythm of life. What had once been taken for granted, standing in front of the camera, working long hours non-stop, constant movement, now became challenges that demanded absolute caution. During this period, Bob faced not only physical recovery, but also a completely different mental state. After standing so close to the edge of permanent loss, He began to look back at his entire life from a new perspective. The pressures that had once occupied his mind for many years, the professional expectations, the prolonged failures, the belated successes all seemed to lose much of their old weight. Instead, a simple but profound awareness began to form. Life is not a given, and time is not something that can be stretched infinitely. It was from that awareness that Bob Odenkirk began to change his approach to work. He did not withdraw completely from his career, but he clearly slowed down. Professional decisions were no longer placed under the pressure of having to prove himself at every moment, but began to be considered based on health, balance, and the ability to maintain long-term life. His career was still important, but it was no longer the sole center of existence. In this change, family became the clear focus more than ever before. If family had previously been the place that helped him maintain balance amid professional pressures, after the incident, it became the main anchor of his entire life. Everyday moments, simple conversations, the presence of loved ones all began to carry a deeper meaning, as if every moment became more precious after he had come so close to losing it. Bob Odenkirk's way of thinking about life also changed markedly over time. He no longer viewed life through the lens of how long his career would last or how great his success would be, but began to pay more attention to the quality of each living day. Things that had once been seen as secondary, like rest, quietness, or time for himself, now became essential elements, indispensable in his daily rhythm. What was notable was that this change did not diminish the value of his career, but on the contrary, created a new balance between work and life. Bob still continued to act in films, still continued to appear in big projects, but at a different pace, with a different awareness. Each role, each project now was not only a professional opportunity, but also a choice made with more careful consideration of health and mental state. In the time between life and the silence that had been so close, Bob Odenkirk went through a profound transformation without needing stage lights or public recognition. It was an inner process, where he was forced to face the real limits of his body and time. And from then on, he was no longer a person completely swept up by the pressure of the entertainment industry, but became someone who understood more clearly the value of simply being able to continue existing. The life and death moment did not end his life, but it reshaped the way he lived the rest of it. After the period between life and nothingness, when Bob Odenkirk gradually recovered from the heart attack that seemed to have ended everything, he did not return to his old life, as if nothing had happened. No longer the man of non-stop working days, and no longer the artist who always pushed his own limits to the point of exhaustion, Bob returned to the Better Call Saul set, in a completely different state of person who had been broken by time and the incident, but still persistently stood up to finish what he had started. His return did not come with glamour or a clear sense of victory. It was quieter, slower, and heavier. Bob's body no longer reacted as before. Every workday became a challenge that required calculation and restraint. Long scenes, complex psychological segments, and the pressure to maintain acting quality in a series that had become iconic all demanded that he expend more energy than before. But instead of withdrawing, Bob chose to continue, not with the explosion of ambition, but with the perseverance of a person who clearly understood his own limits. During this period, Bob Odenkirk's spirit also changed markedly. If before he had been driven by self-doubt, by the desire to prove his value after many years of being underrated, now his motivation became simpler but deeper. To finish what he had started, it was no longer the question, "Am I good enough?" but "How far can I continue with what I have built?" This change made the way he approached the role calmer, but richer in depth than ever before. Better Call Saul in its final stage was not just a television project, but became a symbolic ending journey. The character Jimmy McGill's Saul Goodman reached the final point of his transformation, and Bob Odenkirk simultaneously reached the end of an artistic journey that had stretched over decades. Every scene shot during this period carried a special emotional weight, not only because of the story's content, but also because of the reality that the person portraying it had once stood very close to the edge of the end. Even though his body was no longer the same as before, Bob still continued working with an astonishing determination. He no longer moved at the old speed, no longer endured the intensity of work like in previous years, but he brought a different kind of energy, a deeper, quieter, and clearer presence in every scene. The very physical limitations seemed to make each expression, each glance of his carry more weight, as if every moment on screen was distilled from real-life experience. As Better Call Saul approached its conclusion, the world began to look at Bob Odenkirk with a completely different eye. No longer the underrated comedy writer, no longer the supporting actor who unexpectedly shone, but a complete artist who had gone through every level of the entertainment industry to finally achieve full recognition, the praise from critics, the respect from colleagues, and the affection from global audiences no longer carried any sense of surprise, but became confirmation for a long journey full of perseverance and endurance. What was special about this period was that success did not come like an explosion, but like a prolonged wave, spreading gradually through each season, each episode, each acting moment. Bob Odenkirk was not recognized just for a single role, but for the entire process he had gone through to exist in that role in the most authentic and profound way. Success, in his case, was no longer a destination, but became a belated confirmation for all the years that had once been considered invisible. In the final stage of Better Call Saul, when everything was gradually wrapping up, Bob Odenkirk was no longer the one trying to rise up. He was the one who had gone through the entire journey, who had been broken, who had recovered, and who still stood there to complete the final chapter. And that very image of man who was not perfect, not invincible, but still continued to the end, had become an important part of the legacy he left for audiences around the world. After Better Call Saul came to an end, and the long journey of Jimmy McGill's Saul Goodman reached its conclusion, Bob Odenkirk no longer stood in the position of an actor seeking recognition. He had been there. He had gone through all the levels of his career, from anonymity, being underrated, to being honored as one of the finest television artists of his generation. But what made Bob's legacy special was not in the moment he reached the peak, but in the entire long road full of failures, delays, and being forgotten before that. Bob Odenkirk's legacy was not built on a series of quick successes or easily visible explosive moments. It was formed from dozens of years of working in the shadows of the entertainment industry, where he was continuously overlooked, continuously placed in supporting roles, and continuously had to prove his value in environments that did not favor him at all. It was that long chain of unrecognized years, rather than just the later successes, that created the real depth for his career. Perseverance became the central element in the entire story of Bob Odenkirk's life. He was not someone who achieved early success, nor someone who was given conditions to become a star from the beginning. Instead, he was the model of an artist who had to go through so many failures, so many periods of being underrated, and so many moments that seemed to have no future, in order to finally step into the light in his own way. That very endurance, more than any award or role, shaped the way the world perceives him today. Hollywood, which often favors quick and clear success stories, gradually had to change its view of Bob Odenkirk. When Better Call Saul was widely recognized as one of the finest television series, and when his performance as Saul Goodman/Jimmy McGill was seen as one of the most complex roles in the history of modern television, the industry began to look back at his entire journey from a different angle. No longer just an actor who suddenly succeeded, Bob was seen as someone who had quietly built the foundation for that success over many decades. The role of Saul Goodman, from a seemingly unimportant supporting character, had broken beyond the limits of the script to become a cultural icon. This character not only represented sharp humor in Breaking Bad, but also became the center of a profound story about human transformation in Better Call Saul. Saul/Jimmy was not simply a role, but a long psychological journey, where choices, mistakes, and circumstances continuously collided to create a complex person, both pitiable and thought-provoking. And it was Bob Odenkirk who brought all that depth to the screen with rare patience and subtlety. When looking back, people did not only see Saul Goodman as a famous character, but also saw a milestone in the history of modern television. A supporting character became the center of a spin-off series that was artistically regarded even higher than the original, and that could not be separated from Bob Odenkirk's performance. He did not just play that role, he had lived with it for many years, turning it into a part of his personal legacy. From a broader perspective, Bob Odenkirk gradually came to be seen as a model of perseverance in the entertainment industry. He did not represent glamorous success, nor was he the story of a talent that exploded immediately and then dominated the industry. Instead, he represented a slow, long road full of doubt and failure, but one that ultimately led to full recognition. His story became proof that a career does not always follow a straight line, and the value of an artist is not always measured by the moment they become famous, but by the length of the perseverance they maintained before being seen. In that context, Bob Odenkirk's legacy was no longer limited to one role or one specific period. It became the synthesis of the entire journey, from the comedy writer standing behind the lights to the underrated actor to the belatedly recognized television icon. And it was precisely the combination of prolonged failure and belated success that created a story with special weight, different from most career paths in Hollywood. In the end, Bob Odenkirk was not remembered only because he succeeded. He was remembered because he did not stop for dozens of years when no one had truly seen him, and that very thing had turned him into an important part of how the world understands perseverance, art, and the value of a life that does not give up even after going through many years of not being recognized. After Better Call Saul came to an end, Bob Odenkirk stood in a position that very few artists in the entertainment industry could reach. A career fully recognized, not only by the general audience, but also by critics, colleagues, and the history of modern television. But if looking back at the entire journey, what was clearest was not the peaks he reached, but the two parallel lives that had existed for more than 4 decades. Two different people living in one body, enduring together, existing together, and nearly being swallowed by the very industry they served. One of Bob Odenkirk's 2 lives was the comedy writer, the one standing behind the lights. This was the person who had spent dozens of years creating laughter for others, but almost never stood at the center of attention. He wrote for Saturday Night Live, participated in foundational comedy projects, co-created programs highly regarded by professionals, but for the most part, he was invisible in the eyes of the public. This was the life of quiet perseverance, of long nights writing scripts, revising every line, and watching others become the face representing ideas he had helped create. The other life was the actor, the one who had to wait a very long time to be recognized. This was the Bob Odenkirk of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, the one who finally stepped out of the shadow of invisibility to become one of the most important faces of modern television. But even in that light, his path was not easy. Success came late, stretched over many years, and always came with the memory of long periods when no one paid attention to him. He was not a star who exploded immediately, but a person who had gone through almost his entire professional life before the world began to truly see him. These two journeys were not completely separate, but always intertwined and influenced each other. The comedy writer had created the foundation of thinking, the sharpness, and the ability to observe people for the actor. The later actor, in turn, brought all the overlooked experiences, the prolonged failures, and the quiet perseverance of the comedy writer to the screen, turning them into emotional depth in every role. But this parallelism also created a prolonged pressure, the feeling of always having to prove himself, no matter the role, no matter the stage of his career. Both of Bob Odenkirk's lives carried their own forms of trauma. For the comedy writer, it was the prolonged invisibility, the feeling of contributing but not being properly recognized, the years of working in the shadows of the entertainment industry. For the actor, it was the long, endless wait, the roles that were not big enough to change his position in the industry, the feeling of always standing on the edge of recognition. But what was special was that he never abandoned either of those paths, but continued to live in both until they finally intersected at the same point. The moment Bob Odenkirk collapsed on the Better Call Saul set became a powerful reminder that both of those lives were inseparable from his body and spirit. The pressure accumulated from decades of work, from constantly having to prove his value, from always being on the boundary between success and invisibility, finally pushed him to a limit point. But it was precisely from that limit point that a profound change took place, not only in his career but also in the way he viewed life. After that incident, Bob Odenkirk was no longer the man chasing recognition as before. He no longer needed to prove that he was worthy because his journey itself had become the clearest evidence. His career was no longer a race, but became a complete chain of stories where each phase had its own value, even the phases that seemed like failures. When looking back at the entire journey, the final image was not a perfect Hollywood star, but a human being who had gone through almost every state of the profession. Invisible, underrated, waiting, belatedly exploding, and finally fully recognized. Bob Odenkirk was not the story of quick success, but the story of long-term existence in a harsh industry where very few people could go the full distance without losing themselves. And precisely because of that, when the world finally saw him more clearly than ever, what they truly saw was not just a talented actor, but a person who had fully lived two parallel lives in the same journey and somehow had kept both until the very end. Looking back at Bob Odenkirk's entire journey, one cannot help but feel a profound ache for a life that had to live too long in the state of not being seen. From the very first years writing scripts for Saturday Night Live to the long period working in the shadows of the comedy industry, he was always the one standing behind the lights, creating laughter for others, but rarely being recognized for his true value. Even when participating in Mr. Show, a work highly regarded by professionals, he still could not step out of the shadow of anonymity in the eyes of the public. That made his life become a long chain of quiet perseverance, where talent did not always come with timely recognition. Yet the tragedy, and also the greatest beauty in Bob's life, was that he did not stop. He continued to live in two lives, a comedy writer overlooked for decades, and an actor who had to wait until Breaking Bad and then Better Call Saul before the world truly saw him. Even when he reached the peak with the role of Saul Goodman, it was still a belated journey, carrying the echoes of dozens of years of being underrated. The moment he collapsed on the set was not only a medical incident, but also like a convergence point of all the pressure accumulated throughout his life. From this story, Americans can draw a very practical lesson. Success does not always come at the right time, and a person's value is not measured by the speed at which they achieve it. Bob Odenkirk is proof that quiet perseverance, even when stretched out in invisibility, can still create a solid legacy. But at the same time, his story also reminds us that prolonged pressure without release can lead to serious consequences for health and spirit. In a society that values speed and early success like America, sometimes the most important thing is not how fast you go, but whether you are durable enough to finish the entire road. Bob Odenkirk has completed that journey not perfectly, not easily, but full of humanity and worthy of respect. If Bob Odenkirk's story has touched you, please hit subscribe to journey with us in those emotional stories behind the lights of Hollywood. Thank you for listening, and see you again in the next video, where we continue to explore the extraordinary lives hidden behind the silence.